Welcome back to Politics and Media, our discussion of the Stephen Lawrence case. At the end of the first part there, Paul was making the point that, in some ways we live in a different world now where the locus of racism has moved on. 18 years ago, there was no 9/11, there was no... Islamophobia wasn't a word that you heard routinely on any side of the political divide. So do you think that part of what's happened here is that the racists simply have a new focus now? I mean, perhaps it's a bit like saying, you don't hear so much about anti-Semitism as you did in the 30s. It still exists, of course, but, it moved on. And do you think that part of what's happened is that the kind of targets of the racists have moved on?
Absolutely. I think, as we move through time, there'll be different, focus. But I don't believe that we've solved it, that it's moved away from the African Caribbean community or away from the Asian community. I think there's still an underlying issue within broader society around the way in which we deal with difference. And I think there is still an issue for institutions, not just the police, but across the public sector, to look at the way in which we deliver services to a broad range of people from different ethnic groups, different faith groups. And I think, I always say this, I look at London and say it's fantastic because we've got so many different ethnic groups, faith groups, etc. And that's what makes London, one of the world's cities. It's a fantastic place to be. But that is the very challenge for our public services, to deliver services that meet those all of those individual needs. And that's the 21st century challenge.
Yeah, I agree.
No, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because, I mean, there seems to be that you could both have a new target and a persistence of the older and more established forms of racism, if you like. I mean, I remember in the middle of the riots, the activist Lee Jasper making a speech where he said, well, I'd like to thank the Muslim community for holding open the position of, first victim of racism, but we're back with it's talking about the Afro-Caribbean community, that suddenly that reoccurred in the middle of the riots. It wasn't about Muslims, it was the focus back on the Afro-Caribbean community.
And I can tell you another story around that. I remember when I first went to work, and the very first job I had, I worked with this very nice Jewish lady, and she says to me, we're always so grateful to the black community. And I said, why not? Why is that then? And I was a little bit surprised because she took the heat off of us. And I think the issue is that racism is colourblind, if that's a perverse thing to say, but it doesn't matter who you hate. It doesn't matter whether it's a Muslim or a Afro-Caribbean. As long as someone's a hate. And I think it's only the issue is that where the tip of the hatred iceberg at the moment is Islamophobia, but underneath the submerged level is anything that's different. And I think that's something we need to be really, really careful about. It's a serious problem.
Well, that has moved on in the course of 18 years. It's interesting when you look at, for instance, where the far right organises. Back at the time, I mean, I guess it's still true of the area in South East London, less true of some of the inner city areas in London, less true perhaps in Tower Hamlets than it was that time ago. Perhaps harder for the racists to get a hearing there, do you think, because London's changed, or not?
Well, Bevan would be better qualified than I to comment on that. But we still have places like Barking and Dagenham, which of course is right in the middle of London, which is a serious problem. I think that I think at an individual level, I think that the racism is a busted flush at a kind of political level, at an individual level, because I think that individually we recognise the stupidity of it. Not everyone with a conscience looks at the pictures from the Lawrence inquiry and just is reviled by it, because no British person wants to be associated with that, because it's clearly hideous. I think there's a rather amusing overlay to this that's actually worth just putting there. You might not want to talk about it at the moment, but it's worth reminding ourselves of. At the same time, we've got this kind of where I think there is some institutional progress, not success, progress. It is ironic, is it not, that now we're finding that business is there's a certain enlightened self-interest from the business community, because more and more and more of their customers look less and less and less like the people that are trying to sell them services. And that raises some interesting issues around how we engage culturally with one another, because if they're right, and the BRICS economies are the big economies, you know, Brazil, Russia, India, China, if those are the big, where the big businesses decisions are being made these days, then that's going to raise quite an interesting challenge to us as a British community in terms of how we start to interact. So I think there are a number of drivers that are working. I think there's the caricature stupidity of racism that's embodied in Dobson and Norris. I think there's the institutional drive whereby people have been legislated against using the N-word, and I think there's also the commercial imperative that says, well, actually, in a global economy, this kind of narrow-minded, blinkered, parochial colonialism isn't going to fly anyway. So there are lots of drivers that are moving in a good direction for us.
Well, let's come back to that, because that sort of raises a whole series of sort of socio-economic, you know, preparers of racism or anti-racism, but just on the question of whether or not you think that an integrated London has become a more difficult place for racists or not, or does the resentment build up precisely because of that? How does it look from the police's point of view?
You know, certainly from the Black Police Association perspective, if I want to separate it out in terms of the internal aspects of how black personnel, you know, operate within the police service and service delivery. You know, when we look internally, there are still challenges there, you know, in terms of progression, that certainly in terms of chief officer level, ACPO level, there are fewer black and ethnic minority personnel at that level. We've still only had one Chief Constable, Mike Fuller, in the last 18 years. And there are very many talented people from black and ethnic minority backgrounds in the police, you know. We've seen over the last 5 years that a number of senior officers from black and ethnic minority backgrounds leaving the police service, not being satisfied with the way in which they've been treated. And I think these are the more thorny issues. What's the difference in terms of being a black and ethnic minority senior leader in the police service, and I would guess to say anywhere in the public sector? What are the needs that are there? What's not being provided? What further support is needed to ensure that we do have fair representation? Because coming out of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, remember the Home Secretary set a number of employment targets which were later debated as to whether or not they were realistic, and we didn't achieve them in London in terms of Metropolitan Police. But these are some of the issues we have to start looking at. We have to start you know, putting the microscope under. In terms of disciplinaries, there is still more disciplinary action proportionately against black and ethnic minority officers, not just in the Met but across the country. Why is that? Why is there disproportionality in terms of stop and search? You know, what's actually going... So this is where we have to really zoom in. This needs even greater work. And in terms of corporate memory, again, you know, certainly within the Black Police Association, there's a feeling that the progress we made is embodied within individuals. Okay, so people talk about your John Greaves, Mike Fuller, etc. And corporately, yes, there's progress. But if we look at the Mark Duggan shooting, again, where was the corporate memory around Tottenham, around Broadwater Farm? And in a sense, you know...
And crucially around talking to the families and the relatives, yeah.
And again, I think we let senior leaders down from a corporate perspective within the police, that there is not the infrastructure to say, look, this is the history of this area, because they're going to have competences around, you know, dealing with burglaries, etc. But what you want is an additional platform that says, well, this is the social history of this area. These are some of the sensitivities, and this is not just one generation. This is going across 2 or 3 generations. And so this coming together with particular external factors may lead to challenges, mainly to public disturbance, etc. And I think that's a level of sophistication that we have to now get to. The other concern for me is hearing the voice of the black community, of black individuals, without there being said, well, they would say that anyway, wouldn't they? They've got a chip on their shoulder. Yeah, I think when we talk about progress, we have to be able to measure progress, not just from the voices of those that lead our institutions, and that's quite right that we do that, but we also have to hear from the individuals themselves, from the black and ethnic minority communities, and their voices have to have some validity as well, and I think sometimes their stories are not heard.
Well, there's an interesting case in point, isn't there, really, with Diane Abbott's remarks the following day, which have become, in the media, I think, connected, if not in a direct way, but simply in the way that they're placed side by side, in the way in which they occurred, on subsequent days. Here's a, extremely well-known MP, black woman, well known for speaking out, makes a remark on Twitter, which lots of people have said they quite understand the basis of the remark, and yet it's blown up so that it almost seems to carry the same weight as the Lawrence verdict. I mean, I think we all know that in 10 years' time people will remember the Lawrence verdict, they won't remember the Diane Abbott remark. But for a moment here, there's something happening with the media which is purposely or otherwise deflecting from a very clear message that was coming out of the Lawrence trial.
I think this is about sensitivities from the majority culture. Those from the black community would understand where Diane is coming from in terms of her comments. And it's interesting that it wasn't sort of like the person responsible for equalities from the Labour Party that came out and said anything. It was Ed Miliband himself, which for me raised a whole range of questions. But I think there is still, it demonstrates the huge sensitivity around race that's in this country. That when we sit around the table to talk about issues of race, almost sides almost drawn in a sense, rather than saying, look, this is a societal issue. This is about progressing our institutions. This is about ensuring that all individuals are treated fairly and justice and have the opportunity to fulfil their aspirations. I think what happens is that there is still defensiveness, and we need to get rid of the defensiveness around issues of race.
How did you read that? Because I mean, if you imagine it the other way around, well, we don't have to imagine it. I mean, Dr. David Starkey made equally sweeping, well, actually a great deal more sweeping generalisations and offensive generalisations in the middle of the riots, but you don't have the Prime Minister or the leader of the opposition intervening in the debate.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the one of the real issues, I think, around this whole piece and the whole race discussion is that there's clearly a kind of leadership vacuum. And I think that it is important and is incumbent upon people in positions of leadership to be judicious. I suspect that Diane will reflect on an own goal, really, and I think that what she says needs some thinking about. I mean, my own particular view on it is that I certainly don't think you can level it up to Starkey, and don't even begin to tell me you can level it up to Stephen Lawrence. But I think what I do want to say is that, from my point of view, I think in a leadership position, and Bevan is a leader in his role as I am in mine, as Diane is in hers, what I would say is that I think that we have a duty not to be held to a higher standard as well. I think it's important. I mustn't say to you, you mustn't treat us like this and say bad things about black people. I must be able to model the kind of behaviour that makes that inexcusable. It's not excusable for me to then say something like that. So I think that what do you say about the remark or not? For me, it's injudicious. For me, that it's a particularly careless thing to do, and I'm disappointed that if Diane really does understand, if what Diane's sentiments of what she's saying she believes, then you should have had more wisdom than to score an own goal like that, if that's true, because she certainly has scored an own goal on that front, which was disappointing.
But I mean, in a way, I mean, what was missing out of that tweet was the qualifier "some." If it had said some white people like to divide and rule, and seeing it was in the context, I think the hashtag was about colonialism, wasn't it? Yeah. So, I mean, in a country where both the Irish and those from India and Pakistan know that the British left their countries precisely by divide, I mean, literally by divide and rule. It's not. I mean, it's not a sort of outrageous. I mean, even if you say it's an own goal, it's not an outrageously stupid remark to make, is it?
In context. But it's the context that's the point, you know. But I think again we've got to be very careful about this kind of the way that we respond in this sort of social media knee-jerky way. And that you've got this incredible picture of Diane in that rather humiliating situation on the television. The following morning we wake up, and what do we discover? That in the tribute to Bob Holness, the very person that's castigated her for her tweet, has given a tribute to Ed Holness, who was the host of Blackbusters. You know, and you say. What are you people doing? And I just think we've got to be careful, is all I'm saying, and be careful in the way that we talk. And if it requires 4 more characters to say what you need to say, then use a different medium.
Okay, let me just, we're moving towards the end of the discussion now, but just let me go back on to a point that you were talking about earlier about the kind of broader social and economic conditions, and you were listing some that were perhaps driving towards improving the situation, including the kind of corporate need to appeal to a much wider consumer base ethnically than they would have done in the past. And I guess that's true. I guess the first time it really struck me was when the United Colours of Benetton started, deliberately doing that. But it's pretty much become universal or much more widely applicable. So that so I'm saying, yeah, there are those things going on, but we've also heard warnings, I think, from the police themselves that we're living in an age of increased austerity, that we must expect more social discontent. That I don't think the police made this point, but it's obvious to any serious social observer that will involve race as well as economic deprivation. So what do you make of this? That there are some things that are driving in this direction, but we're living in, perhaps since the 1930s, the first time where we faced economic challenges of this scale, and what do you think that will mean for racism?
Well, I think that whenever there is austerity, whenever there is scarcity, I think people begin to run for cover, and I think lines are drawn between haves and have-not, the ins and the outs, and all the rest of it. And again, this is why I think the leadership point is so important, because we need at this time to stick together. We need to work our way together. We're not going to gain anything by ripping and tearing at one another. That's not going to help us. I think the risk is very high. I think that there is this constant desire to demonise somebody, to blame somebody, to not accept responsibility for our own stuff. And the race card is as easy a card to play as anybody else. Now we can play a racial religious card too, which is that's a double whammy. So I just think we need to be careful. I think we need to be sober. And actually, dare I say it, we need to be British in terms of what we say are our values, which is about fairness and decency, because there's enough for everybody, and we will solve the problem by working together. We will not solve the problem by tearing each other apart.
Bevan, so what do you make of those remarks coming out? The senior police officers, I think, on a couple of occasions have said this, look, it's looking grim. Do you think it's special pleading about the police facing cuts as well as the other people? Do you think it's a genuine concern that there's going to be a much more difficult job to do and a warning to politicians, both?
I think it's a realistic commentary on the state of the country, and I think it's also a statement that says, look, issues of racism, the disturbances that we've seen are not just about the police. It's about, if we look at the issues of deprivation, many in the black community, particularly in the inner city areas, would say that, they've been in a situation of austerity for many, many years before, official government measures were put in place. And so I think we have to remember that many in black and ethnic minority communities find themselves living in the poorest areas of the country. And so when we talk about fairness and we talk about justice, it's to look to see, well, what services are being provided to those inner cities. And I certainly agree with Paul that, you know, when we get to a situation where everybody across the country is, you know, facing the same kinds of situation about deciding where you spend your money, where the next penny is going to come from to provide, that will, I think, to a certain extent, exacerbate already existing differences, and also it will cause individuals to look at who's actually receiving services and who isn't. You know, it will bring back the debate about white working class youngsters versus black working class youngsters, which I think was completely wrong when we looked at the education outcome. If you remember a few years back, it was saying, well, you know, the reason that white working class boys are not doing so well is that so much had gone into trying to improve the standards of you know, black boys, rather than saying we need to improve the standards for everyone. You know, I think when we get to a stage in society where austerity is really gripping families, that's the time when you know, people start to pass the buck and start to focus on difference.
Well, that brings us to the end of the discussion. Bevan Powell, Paul Anderson-Walsh, thank you very much for joining us. We'll be broadcasting this again on YouTube, so if you want to see it or share it with your friends, you're welcome to catch up with us there. And of course, we'll be broadcasting again next week on Politics and Media. Please do join us.